Welcome to UO Today. I'm Barbara Altmann, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Our guest today is Bob Doppelt, Director of Resource Innovations and the Climate Leadership Initiative in the Institute for a Sustainable Environment at the University of Oregon. His program assists the public sector, community groups, and private companies in developing, implementing, and evaluating sustainability and climate change mitigation and economic development plans and policies. Bob participated in the international program on the management of sustainability in Zeist in the Netherlands. He is an expert in systems dynamics and change. His latest book is The Power of Sustainable Thinking: How to Create a Positive Future for the Climate, the Planet, Your Organization, and Your Life. He is also a regular columnist on global warming for the Eugene Register-Guard. Welcome, Bob.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
And we're very pleased to have you. And I'd like to ask you right off the bat, what is the Climate Leadership Initiative?
We are a global warming research and technical assistance program in the Institute for a Sustainable Environment here on campus. And we help mostly governments and private companies, private organizations, analyze their risk and exposure to global warming and to develop policies and programs to address the problem.
Does that continue into implementation of the programs they design as well?
Absolutely. Although most of the organizations are new in it, so they're just begun implementation, but we do a lot of evaluation for government and for the private sector. And we help them analyze their programs, figure out how to improve them and learn from them, and go further.
I suppose we ought to back up and begin at the beginning with some basic definitions and concepts. So could you start off by explaining what you understand by the term sustainability?
Sustainability is really about living within systems limits. Each of us and every organization, every local government, is embedded in larger economic, social, and especially ecological systems that provide for that organization's well-being. And when we push beyond the limits that those natural systems have, those systems deteriorate and eventually collapse or break down. So sustainability is really about adopting the right policies, programs, and practices that allow the organization to live within those systems and in fact enhance those systems. So for example, we want to make sure that a private company is not undermining the natural resource base that it relies on for its raw materials, or the climate, the atmosphere, the atmospheric systems that encompass the globe that create all of life here on Earth. So we really try to help them understand those limits and what systems mean and how to live within those systems.
Could you give some examples of what is unsustainable thinking? You call them in some of your writing sustainability thinking blunders.
Right. Well, the biggest thinking blunder is when we're blind to those systems. I call it systems blindness. We're sometimes blind to the systems we're part of because we don't think about the effects we're having elsewhere around the globe. We only think of the effects close to us. So a company creates pollution out of its smokestacks and it says, well, we've met DEQ or EPA standards locally, we must be fine. But we don't realize that those emissions may be going up into the atmosphere and affecting someone 1,000 miles away or in another country. And so there's that kind of temporal or spatial systems blindness. We don't understand that we have effects elsewhere. And another kind of systems blindness is the temporal. We don't understand that much of what we do may have an effect somewhere in the future and not immediately. And global warming is a classic example. We have been emitting greenhouse gas emissions for 150 years, and only now are we realizing, whoops, that's actually created unintended negative consequences that are really going to come back and affect all of us. So we have to think about the delays in systems as well as how our actions may affect others elsewhere. And that's really what systems thinking or sustainable thinking is about. And unsustainable thinking is really about not paying attention to those factors and doing things that basically undermine the systems that everyone relies on and a company or local government certainly rely on for their well-being.
I picked up a sentence in a press release about your new book, The Power of Sustainable Thinking, and to me it was one of the most concise and manageable definitions of sustainability that I've seen. It was the following sentence: sustainable thinking involves constantly taking the natural environment and other people today and in the future into account when we plan, make decisions, and act. Is that a summary of what you were
That's
just...
a very good summary. Right,
Yeah.
That's right. We have to think about the effects of our activities today on people here and people in the future, and people around the globe and future generations. That's exactly true. That's exactly it. Another way to think about sustainability is that it is the ability to adapt to change. Sustainability means to be able to continue something over time indefinitely. But of course, nothing remains the same forever. So what we really want to be able to do in order to sustain ourselves over time is have the ability to adapt and change to different changing conditions. That requires that we don't lock ourselves in by pushing systems out to the edge of their limits, that we leave some space, if you will, so that the environment, the atmosphere is not completely already stretched to the limits on greenhouse gases. We have room, for example, if we needed to create more to allow a local economy to expand a little more, et cetera. Right now, we stretch all those systems to their limits, and many of them are breaking down. So we don't have the ability to adapt to change very well.
At the corporate level, I know that you have raised examples of some large companies that have done assessments of their in-house practices and then made changes that have had a considerable impact. Could you tell one or two of those examples?
Yeah, some of the best examples come from a company called Herman Miller, which makes commercial office furniture. And they've always been a very participatory organization. It's an organization I've worked with quite a bit. They're in Michigan, Zeeland, Michigan. They had some of their employees a number of years back came to senior management and said, we're using endangered teak wood in our furniture. We don't like that. That's from trees that are endangered. If we use that wood, it's likely to cause a problem for the forest and the ecosystem that it's at. Let's look for other ways. The management took that into advisement, thought about it for a while, and came back and said, yes, let's switch away from this endangered wood. And oh, by the way, can you look at all the other things we're doing that may be an environmental risk? And so they set up an internal committee to look at their environmental impacts, essentially, and did a thorough analysis from the materials they purchase to the way they use the materials and the way their production systems and the way their goods and services are used. So how do people use their office furniture? What happens to it after it's used and it's going to recycling or to the dump? And they ended up completely shifting the way they make their office furniture, and now you can buy some of their chairs. I have one that is 80% made out of 80% recycled materials and about 80% recyclable. They've substantially reduced their greenhouse gas emissions and other sorts of pollution, and in doing so made millions of dollars, saved money, and captured market advantage because people want to buy those products. So it's a classic example of the ability to sort of begin to think in terms of whole systems and then to really make changes that actually create economic and social benefits as well as environmental benefits.
The initial investment for a company or an organization that wants to begin this process must be considerable. Would you say that that's fair?
Not really.
Okay, tell me why not.
Initially, what I find is that most companies and governments think that there's large costs involved. Most of the cost that really is involved is the time and energy it takes for people to think differently.
Say that again, the time and the energy for people to think differently. Okay.
Because that's really what's at the heart of sustainability and climate protection. It's about thinking in different ways, thinking about these systems, thinking about our impacts throughout their entire life cycle and value chain, et cetera. That takes time because we are very embedded in the current way we think. We go to work every day and all you can do is sort of keep up with the daily challenges. It's hard to figure out some other time. So often it does require the establishment of a team of some kind that's been given the authority and the time by senior management to go think about that. Go assess our impacts, et cetera. So you have that time to sort of take a step back and really look at the broader picture. Then what I find is that often if a company or an organization creates a systems-based strategic plan, as opposed to running right out and doing a project really quickly, they often find that they don't spend a lot of money, and many times they immediately begin to save money. So they go out and try to find the low-hanging fruit. They reduce their energy use right away simply by changing their lighting systems, changing out some of their machinery that may be using too much energy for the equipment they're now, for the process they're now using, et cetera. And they find out that their payback is fairly quick. And they use the payback and the money saved on that as to invest in the next step. And they use sort of a stair-step approach. You take one step, that saves money, builds more information and more understanding, then you take the next step. And those companies end up saving millions of dollars. It's not a cost, it's actually an economic benefit.
Do you see increasing willingness and enthusiasm on the part of corporations and large systems like governmental systems, for example, to engage in that kind of change now?
I'd say yes and no.
Okay.
There's a number that are, and I think there's two dominant triggers. One is crisis. When an organization finds that they're in financial crisis, for example, they often can go one of two ways. They can bury their heads in the sand and say, oh, we're not going to change anything. The really smart ones say, wait a second, is this an opportunity to look at what we're doing and find ways to really improve efficiency, increase efficiency of product? Are there things we can just stop doing that we find out weren't necessary at all, that they started 30 years ago and we just keep doing them and we haven't really thought about it? So there's an opportunity there. And the other is when a company, especially younger companies that are innovative, they're looking for competitive advantage, and they realize that there is a growing energy crisis. Even though we're seeing oil prices come down temporarily, we're not going to see that last over the long term because supplies are coming down and demand is going up, especially in China and elsewhere. So they look at these trends and they realize, what's the future for our company? What's the future in the marketplace? And they say, we're going to take advantage of that. So those kind of the leading organizations or with officials that can see the future and say, let's use a crisis to act, or let's just see the trends and get out in front of those, tend to be the ones that are really at the lead. And then there are a number of companies and organizations, and I would say GM is a good example, that are so stuck in their way, and it's mostly a mindset, but that plays out in the way they've made investments and their infrastructure that's already, they've sunk millions of dollars into, and they don't feel they can change it, so they just keep doing what they're doing, and eventually they run out of steam. As I understand today, GM lost 25% of its value, and now there's questions about whether the whole firm will survive. So I think that's a classic example of what happens. And GM is also an example of a company that was lobbying Congress hard with other automakers to prevent increased auto mile standards because it would have forced them to change. And so by preventing change, they may actually disappear.
Well, it's a pretty dramatic example. Yeah. If we shift from the large organization model to individuals in their homes, I assume the same kind of triggers and the same sorts of incentives are applicable. How would you go about working with a community of homeowners or apartment dwellers to have them effect change?
Well, you're absolutely right that the same kind of process and dynamic takes place in individuals. In fact, the policies we adopt, the technologies we develop in society are a reflection of the way we think. And they are the way we think is a reflection of our values and our beliefs. So the GM problem, as an example, is reflective of the thinking of the senior management and the senior managers that came before them, senior executives. And the same thing is true with individuals in households and in apartment buildings, et cetera. The first step is to sort of help them understand or step back and take a reflection on the way they're thinking about things. And just ask them, how do you think about energy use? How do you think about water use? How do you think about consumption? How much stuff you buy? And what about your waste? And so then when you point out that it's your thinking that leads to your behavior, you can then help people begin to look at and do an assessment in their own home. How much energy do we use, and therefore how many greenhouse gases are we creating? And we have a program through our project at our institute at the university where we're actually helping homeowners and people do that. It's called the Climate Master Program. And through this process of thinking differently, we find that people are reducing their emissions by 2 tons a person on average. So it's been very successful because they're thinking differently and they have a new screen on their thought process all the time. How does this action or this purchase affect my energy use and emissions? And that's a new way of thinking.
I have one quick question and then another one about Climate Masters training. The quick one is, you said that individuals can reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by up to 2 tons annually. What percentage is that of what an average output might be? Well,
that was based on a couple of pilot projects we did here in Eugene. And so I can't remember the exact term, but I think it's about 25 or 35% of an average Eugene household. And that was after one 10-week training program. And it's also after the first training program, because we now think that people are thinking differently. We assume they'll continue to go on after that and find different ways to reduce emissions. So we assume we're going to keep measuring that to see, but we assume that they'll find additional savings in future years.
Can we go back to Climate Masters for a moment? You describe it somewhere as a training program for trainers. Is that correct?
That's right. The Climate Masters program is modeled after master recycling and master gardening programs. That's why the term master is in there. So we provide education, free education or very low-cost education for people in how to reduce emissions in their home. And we're starting now a Climate Master at Work program, working with the Chamber of Commerce here in Eugene. So people get that training on their own and they can apply that information. But in return, because it's low cost, we ask them to go out and work with other people. And they have to give us 30 hours of free volunteer time where they share the same thing that they've learned with others. And so they're spreading the activity, they're spreading the information. So it truly is a train the trainer program.
What is the program like to train those masters? Do they attend classes? Do they sit in seminars together? Can you describe it a little bit?
They come in once a week for 10 weeks in the evening for 3 hours, 2.5, 3 hours. And we have different presenters every night focused on different issues. So an expert in town will come in and talk about energy efficiency in the home. And then the next week, someone will come in and talk about transportation, how you can reduce your car use or use public transportation or shift to bicycling and walking, et cetera. And the next time somebody may come in and talk about your backyard use in your garden. So they get these different areas of training and it's very interactive. They get some information and they do some planning and thinking with the other people in the class that night about what they can do. Then they go out and take a week and do it, come back and share what they did in the last week, and then they get a new set of information.
You had a very elegant and arrestingly interesting process or description of a 4-step process to thinking sustainably. Your 4 bullet points on that were discover, dream, design, and act. Those 4 active verbs that I think are really terrific. How do you get people to move from the discover and dream phases of that to the design and act phases?
Well, first of all, there's 3 fundamentals to change to me, 3 core fundamentals of personal change and of organizational and social change. And it's very important to help people understand what those stages of change are. So that's one thing that I do in my work. I help people understand that there are different phases and it's okay where you are. You're going to be in one of those phases. It's okay there. Here's what you need to do to move to the next stage if you want to. But generally, to move from the early stages of change to the acting stages, people have got to decide that the benefits of a different approach outweigh the downsides by roughly a 2-to-1 ratio. They have to see two more benefits of reducing their emissions or walking to work rather than driving than they see downsides. And if they don't see a 2-to-1 ratio, if you will, 2 benefits for 1, they probably won't make that change. So it's really a process of helping actually people list those benefits out and list the downsides. And what I often do with organizations and with people is then have them examine the downsides and find out, think about how many of those downsides are actually permanent versus temporary. And when you really examine most of the downsides to sustainable activity, what they find is at best they're temporary. And if you, there's a little bit of discomfort, or you may have to spend a little money, et cetera, but ultimately, usually in a not very long time period, they actually turn out to be benefits. And that awareness usually allows people to take the next step to action.
So understanding that an inconvenience can actually be a benefit.
And that it's temporary.
And that it's temporary.
And that you can survive it, in fact, may benefit from it. But right now we just get frightened of them because we haven't really, people don't really take the time to think through what those downsides are. Change is scary, change is tough. But when you take the time to really sort through it, people normally make the change and move on.
So it's getting people unstuck from those old habits of thinking.
That's exactly right.
And that, of course, leads to the obvious question, how much of this is a generational thing? Is it our youth? Is it our young adults who are pioneering these changes?
That's a very good question, and I actually find it to be the opposite, ironically. I first thought that myself. And that's not to say that some of the younger folks are not very active in this, especially if they haven't had any other training in a different way in the past. But I find that people that are still out trying to prove themselves are the least open to change. And so the 30-year-olds, 35-year-olds, which aren't the same as our students, they're little, you know, they tend to be more resistive, and they've grown up in a culture where more has been drummed into them. Much more difficult to change, and they're also thinking about how do I get more from my family and my kids, et cetera. Whereas I find people in their 50s and older who sort of are not necessarily trying to prove as much anymore, actually are much more open to this, with a few exceptions. You know, if you're a corporate executive, you know, who are you know, are sort of embedded in this model of continual growth and profit and accumulation, that's tough to change. But I focus a lot more on the older or the very young.
And by the very young, I'm assuming you mean our high school students, our college students,
That's
our
right.
own teenage children.
K through 12, K through, you know,
Yeah.
the very young.
Yeah. I have to say my teenage son taught me to drive in a much more fuel-efficient way when I taught him how the car worked. So yes, I've seen that firsthand in my own home. Bob, you said that one of the triggers for change is crisis. And in your materials, in your book, you have, you use the very powerful phrase that global warming is, quote, the greatest failure of thought in human history. That's a pretty powerful statement. Could you elaborate on that a little?
Humans, for the first time ever, have taken steps that now affect or put at risk all humanity on Earth now into the future. Global climate change is the greatest risk to all of humanity that we've ever seen. We have had localized environmental risks and political risks, wars, et cetera, but it's never affected the entire globe for a long period of time. Global warming is affecting everyone, and if it goes too far, we're at the risk of it becoming irreversible. And it's a result of thinking that we could continue to take resources from the face of the earth, energy, fossil fuels, make them into goods and services for human use, and throw out or spit out the other end of this economic process massive amounts of greenhouse gases without affecting the system, the ecological systems that we rely on for life. That is a fundamentally flawed view, and we're now paying for it. And so that's the thinking that really was, it has to change. I call it a basic shift from this take, make, waste thinking to borrow, use, return, or borrow, use, replenish thinking.
Can we go back there? So make, take.
Take, make, waste.
Take, make, waste. And you want to replace that with the other triplet?
Borrow, use, replenish.
Okay. I'm sorry, I cut you off. Please
That's
go on
okay.
from there.
So the take, make, waste is we take it without thought, we make things, goods and services out of it, and we create massive amounts of toxic waste. Borrow, use, return means we understand that any time we extract resources or energy from the earth, we're just borrowing that temporarily. We're using it for our own goods and services temporarily, and then we want to put it back into nature in a way that replenishes nature and does not undermine nature. So we're trying to create closed-loop, ecologically sound systems, and that's the fundamental thinking shift that we need to that needs to occur. That's what sustainable thinking is about.
On the local level, I know you've worked nationally, you've worked with the state of Washington, the state of Oregon, and now you're working, I think, on some of the river bases in the state of Oregon. Could we close just by having you tell us a little bit about what those initiatives are?
We have a project underway where we're downscaling Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change climate models to the Rogue Basin in southern Oregon, to the southern Willamette Basin here in Eugene area, the Umatilla and the Klamath in eastern Oregon. We're finding out what the likely impacts of climate change are going to be over the next 30 to 50 years. Then we're bringing together scientists as well as local government representatives, economic development specialists, et cetera, and talking about how do we prepare for those changes that are coming. And that's really what we're doing. In fact, the next meeting is tomorrow morning here in Eugene for the Willamette Initiative. And what we found so far in the Rogue is not a pretty picture. Global warming is going to mean warmer temperatures in the summer than in the winter. So it's going to get hotter, more hotter in the summer than in the winter. And it looks like within 15, 20 years in the Rogue, we may see a 10 to 12 to 15 degree temperature increase in summertime. Basically, we're going to see the Rogue Basin become more like Sacramento. That temperature is moving north. Has profound implications for the entire area. We find so far that the southern Willamette Basin here is not quite as extreme, but it's also going to see some very significant changes. So we're helping people understand this and then begin to think about how would you change your policies, your programs, prepare for this, take care of your water systems, your sewage systems, your road systems in a way that really begins to, we're not going to be shocked by this when it happens, we're prepared for it.
And that's assuming that we can predict what the influences will be over the next 30 years. That's the period you had determined?
Yeah, 30 to 50 years. I think actually we do have a pretty good sense of the likely impacts. What we don't know is the timing or the extremities of it. The biggest impacts are extremes, you know, and that's what's difficult to predict.
You said the next meeting's tomorrow. I hope we can convince you to come back soon and keep us informed on this process and let us know where things stand.
Happy to do it.
Okay. Thank you so much for coming in today, Bob.
I'm happy to do it. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being with us today. We've been speaking with Bob Doppelt, Director of Resource Innovations and the Climate Leadership Initiative in the Institute for Sustainable Environment. Thanks for watching.